Hello, I'm James Hirst. Welcome to Sitrep, your weekly look at the big issues in defence and world affairs. 2 months after leading a mutinous march on Moscow, the leader of the Wagner mercenary group is reported as killed in a mysterious plane crash. Mike will explain what it means for the future of this Russian private army, which has been doing the Kremlin's dirty work for a decade. We'll also get some thoughts from a former head of the British Army.
It's going to divide Russia. There are those who thoroughly support Putin's line, thoroughly disapproved of the insurrection, the mutiny of a couple of months ago. But then there are others who regard Prigozhin as a hero.
4 UN peacekeepers, 3 of them British, have been hospitalised in Cyprus after a confrontation in the buffer zone. It has caused a war of words between Turkey and the United Nations.
The peacekeepers acted in accordance with their mandate. And I think the Secretary General was very clear in condemning the assault against those peacekeepers.
We'll explain how the buffer zone works and what British troops are doing there. And 6 months after President Zelensky's Wings for Freedom appeal, Ukraine is to get F-16 fighter jets. But don't expect any rapid change in the course of the war.
This is not a simple matter of parking a number of F-16s on the lawn outside Kyiv. It's actually a very, very big undertaking to develop a truly credible combat air capability.
Sitrep with James Hirst and Professor Michael Clarke.
We always aim to explain what events around the world mean for our defence and security. Now, that is something that generally relies on concrete facts, and those are quite hard to come by right now concerning the plane crash, which Russian authorities say has killed the leader of the Wagner group, Yevgeny Prigozhin. We do know the crash has happened. There is plenty of footage of that. We know that his name was one of 10 on the manifest for the private jet flight, along with his deputy Dmitry Utkin and several other senior figures in the Wagner group. So, Mike, is it fair to say with confidence that what was the leadership team of the Wagner group is now out of play, whatever scenario of conspiracy theories you might want to look at here?
Yes, I think we can say that Prigozhin and Utkin, the deputy and co-founder of Wagner, are off the table for the time being. Even if this was an elaborate hoax and they were actually in the second aircraft and have faked their deaths in order to go underground, the reason for going underground, if that's what they were doing in a bizarre twist of the normal story, would be to go underground for 10 years or so until the heat comes off. And in which case, Prigozhin might end up like Lord Lucan. There'd be sightings of him in beaches in Australia or in streets in Argentina. But I think, whether or not this is an elaborate hoax, the fact is these people are not now part of the scene. I mean, almost certainly they are dead. But if by any chance they're not going to have any effect, because the whole purpose of faking your own death is to go underground and just be invisible for several years. So yes, they're off the scene. And what will happen next, of course, is an interesting question in relation to the Wagner group, but also the effect that this will all have in Russia itself.
See, this is where your job gets a bit harder as explainer-in-chief, because if the founders are off the table, what is the Wagner group's future from here, and how significant is that for us and the rest of the world?
Well, they're certainly not going to go away, and they won't disband. They certainly won't integrate into the Russian military for any number of reasons. They just won't. And the point is, the single point that's I think most important is that the Wagner group are making a lot of money in Africa, in Mali, in Libya, in the Central African Republic. They've been involved in Burkina Faso, it is believed. They would like to get involved, and they've been invited to be involved in Niger. And as the Sahel melts down politically, the Wagner group are in a position to take advantage of that. And that's all good for Russia. And so, whatever happens to Wagner as a private military company, the Wagner organization in Africa almost certainly will continue to function because it suits Putin, it suits the Russian state, and it certainly suits them, who are doing very well out of it.
And of course, it is Ukraine that has really brought Wagner to the world's attention. Let's bring in Forces News Ukraine reporter Simon Newton. Simon, what's the likelihood of any immediate impact in the war in Ukraine itself?
Well, Wagner obviously aren't officially anyway in Ukraine anymore. They left several months ago. after spending best part of a year in Bakhmut, basically just throwing bodies into this fight and holding the line, and they've been replaced by, we believe, VDV sort of Russian paratroopers in that area. So in terms of the military impact on the ground, then very little probably, because they weren't actually taking part. They were supposed to be subsumed into the army. Mike mentions the fact that won't actually happen, and that was what prompted obviously this march on Rostov, on Moscow back earlier in the summer. So they clearly don't want to be part of the larger Russian military in that respect. And I think Mike's obviously right that the impact is going to be really felt in Africa and what happens there with these Wagner troops that are there. We saw Prigozhin's last video appearance, if you like, we believe, was this video that came out earlier this week of him possibly in Mali. There was some talk of them doing a deal with the leaders of the coup in Niger. There's lots of fingers in lots of pies over there.
And these are places that Wagner has boots on the ground right now.
Exactly. As Mike absolutely correctly says, obviously Wagner is very useful, has been very useful to the Kremlin over the years. And, I've seen people talking possibly about the Kremlin taking over Wagner in some sort of way, repackaging it, putting their own people into the leadership of it, because it is a very useful body to have. But in terms of military fighters, we've read that, some of the fighters that were in Belarus have now left. A lot of them have gone, we believe, to Africa to, seek fortune there, because that is where they make most of their money. So in terms of immediate impact on the war in Ukraine, possibly very little.
Okay, but I would suggest no tears are going to be shed in Ukraine, or most of Ukraine, for the loss of Yevgeny Prigozhin, because in terms of how Wagner are seen by Kyiv, and to really identify their significance as a military player in the world, they were part of the annexation, and a key part of the annexation of Crimea, weren't they?
They were, yes, and they did play a key part. So they will not be missed by Kyiv at all, obviously. And in Bakhmut, they proved quite an effective fighting force just because they chucked bodies into the fight, and they took the city, a city that had very little strategic importance, but was a kind of a symbol to the Kremlin of a victory. Prigozhin was going to deliver a victory for the Kremlin, which he did to an extent there. So yes, as a military force, them leaving the battlefield will be something Kyiv will be very, very pleased to see.
Mike, we'll talk about the wider implications for Russia in a moment, but can we just look at the fact, it could be coincidence, but this came on the same day that the man known as General Armageddon was taken out of the picture, one of Russia's top commanders, the top commander, effectively.
Yes, Sergei Storovikin. Storovikin was made commander of the whole operation back in October, and then removed again in the new year. I think it was end of January, when the retreat from Kherson was completed. And then he became deputy commander, one of three deputies to Gerasimov, who was then put in charge of the whole operation. And the point is that Storovikin was always close to Prigozhin. He wasn't just close to him because they thought the same sort of thing. They both detested the way the Ministry of Defense worked in Moscow. But Storovikin owed Prigozhin, because in Syria, Prigozhin saved Storovikin's bacon on one occasion. Storovikin was responsible for a very bad attack on a number of his troops were killed, and it was negligence on the part of the commander. And Prigozhin let them blame him for it. And Storovikin owed him. And so the Prigozhin attempted coup, if that's what it was, on the 24th of June, in the march on Moscow, was something that Storovikin almost certainly knew something about beforehand. And they were just too close. So, Storovikin disappeared that night. And then yesterday, he was formally relieved of his command as the Air Force commander. And he still hasn't been seen. He's said to be on holiday. His daughter says he's taking a rest. Most people assume he's under very close house arrest, but it may be worse than that. I wonder, I don't think we will see Storovikin again. I think something will happen to him because he was so close to Prigozhin.
But as you say, actually, effectively, he was removed from that command 2 months ago. So I guess if there's operational impact on the war in Ukraine, it's already happened.
Yes, the Wagner group were making up about 25% of all the troops who were actually doing fighting on the front at one time. And so to have them taken out of the equation is a boost for Ukraine. Not 25% of the total number of troops in the country, but 25% of those fighting on the front line were Wagner people. So that's a benefit, but that benefit they got in June. What the Ukrainians will be pleased about is that this shows further dysfunction in the whole command structure. And of course, the army itself is very split and very factionalized. There are lots of other private military companies running around, more than 20 of them. The VDV, as Simon said, the airborne troops are close to the Wagner group, because a lot of them had been VDV soldiers before they joined Wagner. The GRU, military intelligence, are close to Wagner. They're not very popular. The GRU and the FSB, who are the equivalent to MI6, are not, are daggers drawn most of the time. So this dysfunction within the whole setup is something that the Ukrainians will benefit from. And the Ukrainians, I think, looks as if they want to use this opportunity to make some big moves. And there's rumours today that they've tried some sort of landing in Crimea. I'm not sure about that at the moment. Not an invasion by any stretch, but something to further unbalance the Russian military high command.
Okay, so we've talked about what it means for Ukraine. We've talked about what it means for Wagner. What about what it means for Russia? I'm going to get your thoughts in a moment, Mike. But first, let's hear the assessment of the former head of the British Army, General Lord Dannatt.
It's going to divide Russia. There are those who thoroughly support Putin's line, thoroughly disapproved of the insurrection, the mutiny of a couple of months ago. But then there are others who regard Prigozhin as a hero. I think the other thing to remember is that Prigozhin heads the Wagner group of mercenaries. People will do what they're told because they're paid. So there's quite a group of people who will follow whatever the leadership now of Wagner is. And this is bad news for Putin. Yes, it's good news for Putin insofar as he has shown that he's in charge, he's the tough man, he's the strong man, and he's eliminated one of his opponents. But I'm afraid it's not the end of the matter. This is not the beginning of something, but the continuation of a major split within Russian society. I think he was weakened from the moment that Prigozhin started his ill-fated march on Moscow. He's trying to restore his position. But it's not just the Prigozhin issue that's weakened Putin. The whole issue of the failure of his so-called special military operation in Ukraine, the tens of thousands of Russians who have been killed. All this is building up pressure on Putin. And of course, the sanctions that the West have piled onto Russia, they are having an effect, and they are changing the quality of life within Russia. So pressure is piling on Putin in a number of ways.
Mike, do you agree with General Lord Dannatt's assessment? This is going to further pile pressure on Vladimir Putin?
Yes, I mean, Putin emerges from this immediately stronger, looking like the godfather who has exacted his revenge 2 months afterwards. But ultimately, it just adds to the sense of a gangster state that's almost out of control. And I think Lord Dannatt is also right in terms of the losses that Wagner have taken. I mean, Prigozhin himself, a couple of weeks ago, gave a figure. He said that 78,000 men had cycled through the Wagner ranks. And I think the figure is closer to 100,000 personally, looking at the figures. But he said 78,000, and he admitted that over 60,000 were casualties. 22,000 killed in action and 38,000 wounded in action. And today, this morning, in Petersburg, at the headquarters of Wagner, a big whizzy building that they opened last year, I think in October, November last year. It looks like one of those buildings that you see on the Hammersmith flyover, all sort of glass and domes. And that was their headquarters. It's now closed up. But that was their headquarters. And this morning, people have started laying flowers out of the front of it.
Could this lead to another march on Moscow?
No, I don't think so. But I think it will lead to disunity within the armed forces. There were rumours last night that an Ilyushin 76, big transport aircraft, had gone to Belarus and that Wagner fighters had got into it and were on their way somewhere else. But I don't think there's any chance of a Wagner revolt on anything like what looked to be the scale of June the 24th. But I do think that as Lord Dannatt says, the sense of disquiet within parts of the Russian forces, other private military companies, the airborne force. And so I think those sort of elements will actually pile pressure on Putin and on the Ministry of Defense in Moscow in the weeks to come. But for this week, Putin gets the benefit of looking as if he's the decisive leader at the top. So he'll feel he's had a good week, but I'm not sure he'll still feel that next week.
Okay, well, we will talk more about Ukraine before the end of the programme. But for now, let us turn to Cyprus, where video has been posted online of a digger being used to build a road charging and pushing a clearly marked United Nations vehicle. Now, this is just part of an incident that ended up in the hospitalisation of 4 peacekeeping troops, 3 of them British soldiers. They were in hospital for a weekend. Now, Mike, in the grand scheme of things that soldiers do, that physical damage is not much. But diplomatically, the damage is looking greater. The UN says this road building is part of a violation of the buffer zone. The Security Council has branded this an attack which it says could amount to crimes by Turkish Cypriot personnel. And then in response, we get Turkey's president accusing the UN of unacceptable physical intervention in Cyprus. I mean, this is pretty hard rhetoric, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And again, it's not unconnected to the Ukrainian war for a couple of reasons. One is that a lot of Russian emigres, Putinists, are in northern Cyprus. They have bought up property. They've got citizenship insofar as they can get any useful citizenship out of northern Cyprus. But they're bolstering the economy and the sort of political significance of the northern Cyprus enclave, which, of course, Turkey annexed in 1974 in the invasion of Cyprus. And the second element, also related to the war, is this greater assertiveness by Erdogan, Turkish president, who is making it very clear that he's not going to stand still on the Cyprus issue. I mean, he's pushing on all fronts at the moment to be a more assertive player. And so, although you could say, well, this sort of thing just happens every now and again, it's relatively random, it might be, but I suspect that the well springs behind this sort of event, putting pressure on the peacekeepers, putting pressure on the UN, is part of a different attitude within northern Cyprus to the dividing line that's been there since 1974.
Yeah, Cyprus is a huge part of British military life. Thousands of people have served there. Many more have passed through. But of course, mostly we hear about it because of the airbase at Akrotiri. We hear much less about Operation Tosca, which is where those British troops in UN Blue Berets have been patrolling that buffer zone since 1974 when the island was split in two. Let's bring Simon Newton back in because, Simon, you lived and worked in Cyprus for 5 years, was it?
Yeah, 5 years.
Yeah,
yes.
so you know the buffer zone pretty well. What do you make of this
do.
incident?
Nothing of this sort of magnitude happened while I was there, but I'm not surprised, I have to say, just because of the tensions that exist all the time there. I mean, this is sort of sometimes referred to as a sort of sunshine tour by some people in the military who haven't been on Tosca, but it really isn't that. The sun does shine, but it really is a kind of diplomacy exercise for the soldiers that go there. And there is this constant tension between the two sides that they patrol. The area that the Brits actually patrol, which is through Nicosia predominantly, about 30 or so kilometres, some of it goes down to just 11 feet across. And you have the two sides literally staring at each other across this very small area. So there is always this tension. I've been there when things have sort of blown up and very small things become very big things very quickly. So in some respects, it doesn't surprise me at all. The
UN, I was looking at a UN page about this mission. They describe there were about 1,000 incidents, to use their word, each year in the buffer zone. But they're talking about significantly smaller incidents than this generally. I mean, one of the things that interests me, I'm right in saying that the troops there are unarmed.
They are unarmed, yeah. I mean, they go around in vehicles and sometimes even on bicycles. So it is very much a peacekeeping mission. I remember one incident, for instance, when I was with a group of media who were taking photos, and it was sort of dusk, and one of the cameramen used a flash. From nowhere, dozens and dozens of Turkish Land Rover equivalents sort of appeared, storming towards us, asking us what we were doing and things. So there is this tension all the time that something could happen.
Mike, Cyprus is hugely strategically important to the UK's armed forces. Is that why we've been a constant part of this peacekeeping mission throughout, to protect our assets and capability in Cyprus?
Yes, I mean, we were the power that had most influence in Cyprus before the 1974 coup, and we were part of the arrangement that created independent Cyprus and created a UN peace force in 1961, I think it was. And it's become more strategically important over the years in lots of ways. It's important for our intelligence gathering, so it's a very important intelligence hub. It's strategically important as a jumping off place. Akrotiri is a big base, and Operation Shader over Syria and Iraq are conducted from Cyprus. I mean, we use Cyprus a lot for operations throughout the Middle East, and not least in the Afghanistan operation. It was the sort of the hub going in and out. Most of us who went to and from Afghanistan went via Cyprus at some point. A lot of people were evacuated to Cyprus, casualties, and it was the decompression place. So Cyprus has played many roles in Britain's current military commitments, as it has done over many years, for the last century and a half.
Yeah, Simon, I don't know about you, but I know I'm one of many thousands who've had an unexpected overnight in Cyprus on the way to Afghanistan when things aren't quite working with the planes as planned. Just tell us though a bit more about the buffer zone itself. I mean, it's not deserted. It's not a no-go area. It is a place where people are living.
It is, and I mean, just to give you some context of what's happened. So the geographic location for this is Pila. So this is quite important because this is on the edge of the Esba, the eastern sovereign base area near Dikalia. Pila, the village, which is a mixed Turkish Greek Cypriot village, I think the only one on the island. And just north of that is Arsos, this Turkish Cypriot village. And the conflict arose because they were trying to use bulldozers to build this road. This road has been talked of before because it's in some way politically linked to the opening of a crossing at Limnitis, I think, in the north of the island, which was back in 2010. There was some deal done potentially that they were going to be allowed to open this road and let people through. So there's a backstory to what's actually happened. And as you say, the buffer zone itself, at some points it's 4.5 miles wide. You have farmers, they can get permits for 12 months, I believe, and they can actually go and farm inside that area. And a lot of what the Brits do on the ground is to stop incursions into the buffer zone, smuggling, for instance, people just being randomly in the buffer zone, partying, if you like. That happens, and so it's not a completely demilitarized, depopulated area. There are people going to and from throughout.
I mean, Simon, given life happens in the buffer zone, how come the building of a road can end up being in a war of words with the United Nations?
The key thing you have to understand about the buffer zone is this phrase status quo, which is repeated all the time when you're there, which is that it has to remain exactly as it was when the ceasefire happened in 1974. And they even, I mean, if you go through the centre of Nicosia, the British troops have maps of the buildings, even down to the positions of single barrels in defensive walls that the Turkish side have put up. And I've been with them when they've spotted something really small and innocuous happening and they have to report it back. So that's the key reason that they would have been there to stop this building work taking place. And you can obviously, construction isn't allowed inside the buffer zone. One interesting thing is, in terms of the force numbers, there's 250 British soldiers there. Actually, there are several Russian soldiers also part of this UN mission, I think 4 or 5 of them, and 250 Argentinian soldiers who the Brits actually patrol alongside, which is, given our history, is quite interesting.
Yeah, that's quite the multinational operation. Simon, thank you for sharing that picture with us. Mike, just one brief thought before we move on. I mean, there have been various attempts at achieving a proper peace for Cyprus. We are no closer than we were 50 years ago, though, are we?
No. One thing that is the case, though, is that line, that frozen line, the peace line, has not stopped Cyprus becoming a member of the European Union. It has not prevented Turkey, participating fully in NATO. So it does sort of show the idea that if you can freeze a line, even if it's not a legitimate line, if it lasts long enough, you can still work around it with other political benefits to all parties. So there is a lot to be said for just keeping the line as it is and trying to prevent these sorts of incidents escalating into something that questions the permanence of that line, because then other things start to come unraveled.
This is Sitrep.
Now, cast your mind back to February when Ukraine's President Zelensky was in London and made an historic address to MPs at the Palace of Westminster.
I appeal to you and the world with simple and yet most important words: combat aircrafts for Ukraine, wings for freedom.
Poland and Slovakia responded within weeks, each pledging around a dozen Soviet-era MiG-29s. But it was Western fighter jets that President Zelensky really wanted, and it's taken 6 months to get them. Denmark and the Netherlands, though, have now pledged US-made F-16s with Washington's blessing. It's thought around 40 of them will arrive over the next couple of years. But the first batch, 6 of them, won't even arrive in Ukraine until the very end of this year. 8 Ukrainian pilots are now at a Dutch airbase for F-16 pilot training. That, though, is just the tip of the iceberg. Another 65 Ukrainian personnel are also there, learning how to maintain and service the jets. Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, a former RAF pilot and then commander of the Harrier Force, has been telling Kate Chabot that a lot of work lies ahead to make these second-hand jets into a proper warfighting capability.
The trouble is, I think many misunderstand what an F-16 is all about. As in itself, it's a phenomenally capable platform, but unless you've got the right people, the right maintainers, the right armourers, and you've got the right weapons on board, it will not be very effective in this war. And I think one of the challenges here is this is not a simple matter of parking a number of F-16s on the lawn outside Kyiv. It's actually a very, very big undertaking to develop a truly credible combat air capability.
Yes, Sean, and to pick up on that people point, we know the pilot training is organised, but I was looking at the numbers for the RAF's recent air policing mission in Estonia, and about 200 people deployed to be able to put 6 Typhoons in the air. Presumably the numbers for 6 F-16s are similar. How many of them are also going to need training?
Yeah, the numbers for deployment are somewhat different, but if you took a typical squadron, when I was commanding a squadron, it's around about 200 people, and you have around about 12 to 16 aircraft. Very few, a small minority of those people are pilots. The vast majority are people like the engineers who have to service the aeroplane, the armourers who have to handle all the weapons. And even if you think about servicing the aeroplane, the Russian aircraft, which the Ukrainians have been operating, are very much of a different era. They're fitted by hammers and spanners and oil, whereas modern technology is black boxes, it's diagnostics, and that is a very different concept, and therefore literally probably about 10% of the training element is to do with pilots. The vast majority will be making sure these aircraft are not just Christmas trees on the ground, that they actually can fly and can operate effectively against the Russians.
And that training of those engineers, how long might that take?
If it's a seasoned engineer, probably only a matter of months. I mean, to be blunt, the long pole in the tent here is getting pilots trained. And even when you've got pilots trained, they will be competent at the aircraft, but they will not be very experienced in that role. You can become combat ready on a frontline outfit, but it's 3 years of operational flying before you're considered by the squadron to be effective at being able to lead packages and being a grown-up. The Ukrainians will pretty quickly learn how to operate the F-16. The challenge will be how to become combat effective. That normally takes years. Most of the ground crew, it's simple to learn it from a manual, but the tips about how to get an aircraft to go, it's a bit like a classic car. If you've got an expert there who's owned it for years, he just knows what's wrong with it. Whereas the Ukrainians will not have the benefit of that, will have to refer to the manuals, and that will take them longer to get an unserviceable jet back onto the line and back into the air.
And what about logistics, getting the right parts into Ukraine to keep the F-16s airworthy?
I think that's going to be a bigger issue than perhaps everyone's making out so far. One thing, as you pointed out in the intro, these jets are second-hand. And that's a euphemism for they're quite old. The F-16s are at the end of their life, that they are still capable and competent, but they become a little bit less reliable, a little bit more temperamental. On a standard squadron, about half the aircraft wouldn't be available routinely. 2 or 3 of them would be in deep servicing, having engines out and big problems sorted out, whereas about a half, maybe a third of them would be available on the front line.
And of course, there is no point having the planes if they can't defend themselves and attack Russian forces. Does Ukraine have, or has it yet been promised, suitable weapons?
For me, that's the main point. Most people see an F-16 an air show, and it is an incredibly capable platform, 9G, very agile, very small. But bluntly, that's just an air show. When it comes to warfighting, first of all, it needs to defend itself, and state-of-the-art defensive aids are something that gets evolved every year, and it looks unlikely that the Ukrainians will get state-of-the-art capability. But almost more importantly, what are the air-to-air missiles and the air-to-ground weapons that they're going to be provided with? Again, they are all guided by a radar. The F-16 radar is quite old now. There have been lots of upgrades, but will the West actually provide a modern radar? Difficult to tell, but without being too downbeat about it, let's also be clear that the Ukrainians are currently operating flanker aircraft that are much older than any of the Russian aircraft, much less well supported, with very poor radar and weapons. The F-16 will be a significant improvement on their legacy capability. The challenge is, can they learn to use it and operate it effectively in the limited time available?
Yes, so exactly when do you think, realistically, Ukraine will be able to meaningfully deploy these F-16s?
Well, I know there's a massive appetite that we're all looking at the counteroffensive at the moment. The F-16s almost certainly will not be deployed anytime this year in the battle for the Ukraine front line. So the earliest likely to see jets is likely to be early next year. And I think the Danes were even talking about into 2025 before some of the jets arrive. I think it's worth also pointing out, Kate, that when the F-16 was originally envisaged, most of the senior Western leaders I was talking to said it would be wrong to associate this with the current phase of the conflict. What the West is trying to do is that in post-conflict, Ukraine will need to have its own indigenous combat air capability. And you can't just suddenly wave a magic wand and that appear. So by starting that process now, all of that will culminate almost certainly in a couple of years' time, which should be in time to help provide Ukraine with the autonomous self-defense capability they're going to need to hold the peace.
Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell. Mike, a final thought. It is Ukraine's Independence Day, marking their independence from Russia quite some years ago now. Given everything we've talked about today, how do you think the mood in Ukraine will be and should be?
Well, if I had to guess, I would say it's probably worried but determined. I mean, I think they're worried that the offensive is not going as quickly or as obviously well as they had hoped, and that they are worried that they may be entering into a stalemate that will just go on, and the West will get tired of supporting them. And I think that's a worry, a constant worry. But I think they'll also be determined that this will go on as far as they're concerned for as long as it takes. I think they'll be determined that this Independence Day will be followed by another Independence Day next year and another one the year after, and in due course even an Independence Day celebrated in Crimea. I think they're very determined about that.
Mike, thank you very, very much. And my thanks to all of our guests. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clarke will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. And all being well and lost voices found again, Kate Jabot really will rejoin Mike next week. In the meantime, don't forget you can stay up to date with all the latest military news on our website, forces.net, and catch up with past editions of the programme wherever you get your podcasts. For now, though, from me, James Hirst, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.